Hello, lesson in Luke. Today will be the 23rd message. And it's basically Jesus going to Jerusalem for the Passover at the age of 12. And so we will be in Luke chapter 2 still, verses 41 through 47. Excuse me. So beginning in verse 41, we're told his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they, meaning he went with them, up to Jerusalem according to the custom of the feast. Now, when they had finished the days, as they were returning, the boy Jesus lingered behind in Jerusalem. And Joseph and his mother didn't know it. They supposed he had been back in the company. So they went on a day's journey and sought him among their relatives and acquaintances. And when they didn't find him, they returned to Jerusalem seeking him. Now, so it was that after 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers. As a parent, for any of you that are parents, you can imagine how, traumatizing this whole thing would be. They take him as a 12-year-old for the first time to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. And he is going to be the Passover lamb in another 20 years. And it says that as they finished the days, they were returning to Nazareth, and Jesus was lingering. They thought he was lingering behind. Now, not in Jerusalem. They thought he was traveling with his cousins in the group of people that were all traveling together back home. And so they were not too concerned. For us, if Mick or Greg were traveling and Randy was traveling, for example, with Kevin and Brett and Kristen, then Mick and Greg and Lisa would have been traveling with their cousins. They would have all been together. So you wouldn't give it much thought. You would just assume that they were with your brother or sister in a group traveling. And so they traveled an entire day's journey, which probably was in the range of 20 or 25 miles. And it was time to stop and pitch camp and start a barn fire and fix a meal. And they said, where's Jesus? Have him come back and join us for dinner. And they find out he's not there. And you can imagine the panic that would set in. And they would have to turn around and head back another day's journey to get to Jerusalem. All of this can go through our minds if we're parents. And so as I thought about this, just a number of things jump out at you. As parents, once again, I see this thing hit their comments. Well, we'll see that in the next lesson. As parents, we see Joseph and Mary keeping the law. They were devout. They loved God. They set a perfect example for Jesus to follow. Obviously, they were sinners because everyone is except Jesus. But they were a perfect example as parents for a child. And the God part of him must have been really proud of them. Now, at 12 years old, this would have been, in all likelihood, his first time to go to the Passover in Jerusalem. And perhaps he was left at home with Mary or female relatives before this year, being too young to travel or understand the festival. And women were not required to go up for the festival, but the men had to be there. The question is, did the Lord have the same feelings and emotions as I did when I first saw the city of Jerusalem? When we went in 1984, we pulled up on the roadside on a hill overlooking the valley, and across to we could see the Golden Dome in the distance, and it was very emotional. You get tears in your eyes. You feel like you're at home. I mean, it's hard to explain until you go there and see it. And all of a sudden, it feels like you're supposed to be there. And I would imagine Jesus was feeling the same things when he was going up the hill to Jerusalem. And it says that they were going up to Jerusalem. In actuality, they were traveling from north to south, or going down geographically. But because Jerusalem is set up on a high hill, no matter where you come from, you're going up. And it was a trip roughly 91 miles on foot, a good portion of it going uphill. And it'd be about as far as going from Los Angeles to Santa Barbara out in California, for those that are familiar with the West Coast. On foot, it would have taken a good 3 days to travel 90 miles. It would be like going from 30 miles, 25 miles actually would be like walking from Los Angeles or Glendale to Santa Monica Beach, for those familiar with that area. It would be like us in Texas going from Forney, where we live now, up to Dallas. It'd be about a 30-mile drive. And so this is quite a distance when you're walking the whole way. You're carrying all your belongings on your back. I mean, when they got to their campsite, they had put in a full day. And I imagine they headed out at night, which was extremely dangerous, with all the highwaymen along the way that would attack you and rob you and take all your belongings. But I imagine they turned around immediately and headed for Jerusalem when they realized Jesus wasn't with them. Now, the Passover, the feast itself, is celebrating Israel's release from slavery in Egypt. And the Passover reminds us that the Lord told the Jews how to protect their oldest child by spreading the blood of a lamb on the doorpost, in the pattern of a cross, across the top of the door and then down through the center of the door. And the blood would just pour down over the door, and the death angel would go over the top of their home and move on to the next home. So if they obeyed, their eldest son would be spared. And Egypt wasn't told to do this, and they lost their eldest sons. The feast lasted about 7 to 8 days, quite a time for them, including the travel days. So you travel 3 days and spend 7 to 8 days in Jerusalem, and then travel 3 days back. So it was a lengthy time. We read about this missing son. They traveled towards home for a day and didn't know that Jesus wasn't with them, which is kind of funny and interesting. I mean, they assumed he was walking along with his cousins and all the relatives that were traveling with them, in a big group. And like I said, like Mick walking with Brett on vacation, his cousin. They probably noticed around dinner time as the group was bedding down for the night. Remember, people rarely traveled at night because of the dangers along the way. And so you were such an obedient and perfect son that they probably had no fear that you weren't right by their side in the group. And Jesus, he wasn't in the caravan. He was still back in Jerusalem. It says lingered behind. Hypomeno means to tarry. He wasn't lost. Jesus didn't get lost. He chose to stay behind to have conversations with the teachers and the elders of the people. I mean, how advanced must he have been for a 12-year-old? But because he was sinless, his mind was well advanced compared to other kids his age, or as you or I would have been at the age of 12. It tells us that they did not find him. You have to imagine the shock and the horror for parents to realize they've lost their kid. If it's ever happened to you in Disneyland or in the shopping mall, you turn around and one of the kids isn't there. And I mean, you're panicked, you're terrified. You know, where is he? Did he get hurt along the way? Is he even lost back in Jerusalem? You just imagine the thoughts that would go through your mind if that happened to you. Now they turned back, and I'm guessing it would have been immediately, probably in the middle of the night. I know I would have gone back immediately. I remember how paranoid I was when we went to Disney or Angel Stadium or the beach or the mall. I mean, I'd keep my eyes on the kids constantly. And they were probably 25 miles away from Jerusalem when they realized that he's not with them. And then it tells us that they traveled or were there 3 days looking for him. Imagine not finding your kid for 3 days. It would be total panic. And then it tells us he was in the temple. Where else would the Son of God be? I don't know if they went there first, just didn't see him, or whether they were looking anywhere and everywhere trying to figure out where he could possibly be. But he was in the temple. So a question just came to my mind. What was he doing for these 3 days? I mean, how did he make it? For food, for water? Where did he sleep? Where did he go to the bathroom? I mean, how did he make it through 3 days on his own as a 12-year-old? It's pretty amazing. And then three, so there's so many times that threes come up in the story of Jesus. It's just wonder. I wonder what the significance is with this one. Why was he there 3 days before they could find him? It sure is a long time for a 12-year-old to be alone in a large city with no one there with them. And then we see the teachers mentioned. It says that Jesus was listening to and questioning the religious leaders. And you got to wonder if he was stumping them with his questions. They were the religious leaders, the experts in the law, and yet it says they were astonished with his understanding and his answers to their questions. I mean, question and answering was the customary form of rabbinical teaching from a teacher to a student. That's exactly how the younger ones were brought up. They'd be asked a question, they'd have to answer the question, and they went back and forth. So I thought to myself, what was his questions like? What is it that astounded them? And were they as deep and profound at 12 years old as Jesus was at 12? And imagine, we've seen the interaction between the religious leaders and Jesus when he reached 30. So, you know, he asked them, "What think ye of the Christ? Whose son is he? If David called him Lord, how is he then his son?" I mean, these are the type of questions that Jesus asked. He said, "Which is the first and the greatest commandment?" He asked them, "Who is my neighbor?" I mean, he put these people to the test. And I imagine his questions as a 12-year-old were just as probing and difficult for them to answer. And so just as a point, as a life lesson, as I read through this, I believe I too can grow in knowledge and understanding if I keep a pure heart and a pure mind. It'd be the result of his blessings on me for my obedience to him. And that's the same for all of us. If we obey him and walk with him, then his blessings will be on us and his grace will be on us. And we will be living an entirely different type of life. But as a parent, for those of you that are parents, imagine losing the Messiah. I mean, I just cannot imagine, particularly Mary, his mother, his actual birth mother. How do you lose the Messiah? How do you explain that to God, who is his father? Well, I'm sorry, Father, I lost him. It's an amazing story when you read it and think about all of the circumstances and how it would be for you or I if we were in that position. A comment I read from Barclay, it says, for the Passover season, it was the custom for the Sanhedrin to meet in public in the temple to discuss, in the presence of any and all who would listen, religious and theological questions. So you can imagine in the temple, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Sanhedrin, everybody, all of the top-notch people, the religious leaders, the political leaders were all there listening, asking questions, answering questions. And here's Jesus, 12 years old, stumping them with his answers and with the questions he asked. That they were astonished at what he was saying. And then when we realized the impressive intellect, the insight and the analysis of the Jewish rabbis, this has got to be really impressive. This is something like a middle school child discussing physics with a rocket scientist. I mean, Jesus had a unique advantage having a spiritual relationship with the writer of God's word, since he is God's word. So in the next lesson, we're going to move on to Jesus, who's not lost, yet found. And we'll see some more of this and the response and the reaction of his parents when they finally find him. So that's it for lesson 23. And we'll be back to you next week with what happened. Did they find him? If they found him, how did that go? And so until then, we'll see.